Hi and welcome to Yarra Ranges Live TV. I'm Anthony McAleer, I'm an historian, and I'm here to tell you another story of the history and heritage of the Yarra Ranges. I'm standing at the front of 91 Anderson Street, Lilydale. In the years before the First World War, this was the home to an impressive young man, a gentleman by the name of James Drummond Burns, or J.D.Burns as he was known, or Jim as he was known to his friends. J.D. Burns was a student at Scotch College. He was quite a successful student. He was involved with sports. He was the editor of the school magazine. But more importantly, Jim Burns went on to become the author of a poem that in the end became the most widely read and best received piece of Australian war verse ever. Sadly though, Jim Burns also was going to be one of the casualties on the shores of Gallipoli. Jim Burns's father was the Reverend Hugh Burns, who was the well-respected minister at Lilydale's Presbyterian Church just behind me. His grandfather was the Reverend James Drummond Burns, after who Jim was named. He had been a very popular Presbyterian minister in London and was also the author of a number of poems and hymns. Now, both his father and his grandfather had a reputation for themselves for being for their community service. Now, this affected young Jim quite dramatically because when he was a student at Scotch College, he also impressed many with his dedication to his academic achievements, but also his dedication to the school community. To quote his headmaster, the William Littlejohn, who later wrote, J.D. Burns was the type of public schoolboy that one delights to honour. During the 4 crowded years that he was at Scotch, he lived for the school. We had visions of him, for him, of a brilliant future. At the end of 1914, James Burns finished school at Scotch College and he returned home to Lilydale, preparing to go on to Melbourne University's Ormond College earlier the next year. However, the call to arms was loud for men like James Burns. He had watched his friends from school enlist in the AIF, and he'd seen men from his father's own parish also enlist. In the end, he decided that he could no longer stay. In January 1915, he walked into the building just behind me. This was formerly the Shire Lilydale Council offices, and during World War I was used as the local recruiting office. He walked in here, he was examined by the local doctor, and he officially enlisted in the AIF. Private James Burns was sent to the AIF's training camp in Broadmeadows, where he was allocated to the 21st Battalion. Now, just before he left to go overseas, the congregation at Lilydale's Presbyterian Church held a social for him, a farewell social in this very room. It would be the last time many of them would get to see young Jim. Soon after, Jim's name was added to the honour board that sits in the foyer of the church here. In May 1915, Jim left Australia to go and serve overseas. By this stage, the Australian troops had already landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. His 21st Battalion were landed at Egypt, where they continued their training in the deserts there. Then, in August 1915, they were put on the troop ship Southland to go to Gallipoli. However, on the way, the troop ship was torpedoed and sunk. Luckily, Jim survived this, and eventually the 21st Battalion were landed on Gallipoli. On September 18, 1915, Jim was in the frontline trenches when tragically he was killed by a sniper's bullet. He was just 20 years old and he had only been on the Gallipoli Peninsula for 10 days. His name was later added to the war memorial here at Lilydale. Unknown to Jim, his poem For England, or The Bugles of England, as it also came to be known, was published widely throughout Australia. For many people, the poem summed up exactly how they felt about the war. Now, his poem then went on to be published throughout Australia and also overseas in England. In fact, when it was first published in England, a newspaper attributed the poem to the great British writer Roger Kipling. Now, Kipling responded by saying it wasn't his poem, but he then added, "But I wish it was." When Jim was killed on Gallipoli, the poem was then given added meaning and added importance. It was often used by families for their memorial tributes in the newspapers to loved ones who had been killed in the war. It was read out at special events like unveilings of war memorials. And it was also used as a recruiting tool, not just in World War I, but in the World War to follow, where the same meanings also came to play. In the end, Jim's little poem would become the most widely read and best received piece of Australian war verse to ever be written.
The bugles of England, blowing out o'er the sea, calling for 1,000 years, and calling now to me. They woke me from my dreaming at the dawning of the day. The bugles of England, how could I stay? The banners of England, unfurled o'er the sea, floating out upon the wind, were beckoning to me. Storm-rent, battle-torn, smoke-stained and grey, the banners of England, how could I stay? O England, I heard the cries of those who died for thee, floating like an organ voice across the winter sea. They lived and died for England and went gladly on their way. England, oh England, how could I stay?
But the stark, tragic lesson of the Jim Burns story was the heartbreaking realisation of what might have been. What else could Jim Burns have contributed to our society? What other Australian literary classics were we denied by his death? What could he have contributed to his community? There's no denying that Australia was diminished by the death of Jim Burns, but it was also diminished by the deaths of those thousands of young lives who died during what they came to call the Great War.